The woman's car was moving smoothly through the city streets. She was looking forward to a quiet evening at home, nothing more than the usual routine. Her mind wandered from one small thought to another as she drove, listening to her favorite playlist on the radio. She had been working late again, but that was nothing new. The work was demanding, but it paid the bills, and she loved it. She felt good about herself and was excited to get home to her kids and enjoy a peaceful evening. She glanced at the time. It was a little past 6:30 p.m. There was still plenty of daylight. The sky streaked with shades of orange and purple as the sun began to set. She was just a few minutes away from her home, and she thought about stopping at the store to pick up some milk. The peaceful, everyday feeling was suddenly shattered. Out of nowhere, another car swerved into her lane, slamming into the side of her car. The force of the impact sent her vehicle spinning, the tires screeching against the pavement. Her heart raced and she struggled to regain control of the wheel, but it was too late. The car was forced off the road and into a shallow ditch. She slammed her hands against the wheel, trying to steady her breath, fighting the fear that threatened to take over. She quickly checked her seatbelt and made sure she was unharmed. It was a moment of pure panic, but she didn't have much time to think about what had happened. Before she could react, the sound of multiple car doors slamming shut caught her attention. Her eyes widened as she saw several men moving toward her vehicle. Their faces were covered and their hands gripped weapons, some with guns, others with pipes. The woman's heart pounded louder, a deep sense of dread settling over her. She wasn't sure if it was the accident that had triggered this or if these men had been waiting for her, but she knew she was in serious trouble. They approached her car aggressively, one of them slamming a fist against the window. The glass rattled and the woman froze, unsure of what to do. The man outside shouted at her, his voice full of hatred. "Get out of the car, now!" His words were sharp, full of anger. She hesitated for just a moment, but the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. The man didn't just want money or her car. He wanted something far worse. Fear shot through her body like a freezing chill. Without another second to lose, she unbuckled her seatbelt and tried to open the door, but it was jammed. She yanked harder, finally forcing the door open just as another man reached inside and grabbed her by the arm. She was pulled out of the car roughly, the men's hands cold and unrelenting as they dragged her into the street. She stumbled, trying to keep her balance, but the sheer force of their grip made her knees buckle. The man holding her yelled out more racial slurs, each word bitter and cruel. She could barely process what was happening. She didn't understand why this was happening. She tried to scream for help, but one of them immediately covered her mouth with his hand, silencing her. They pushed her into their vehicle, shoving her into the back seat. She fought back, but her movements were slow and disoriented from the crash. As the doors slammed shut, she could hear the roar of the engine starting. And before she knew it, they were speeding away, leaving her car and any chance of help behind. The woman's heart raced as she realized she had no idea where they were taking her. Fear, like a thick fog, crept over her as the car sped down winding roads, the outside world blurring by. Every twist and turn of the journey felt like it lasted forever, but the one thought that stayed with her was clear. She needed to survive this. She had to stay alive for herself and for her family. The minutes stretched on, and with every passing second, the fear of what might happen next grew. She felt a mixture of anger and confusion building inside her. These men, whoever they were, had no idea who they were dealing with. They didn't know her. They didn't know who her husband was. They didn't understand the strength of the family they had just targeted. But in that moment, she didn't know if it would matter. She didn't know if she would make it out of this alive. The car turned onto a secluded dirt road, and as they bumped along the uneven surface, she felt a sense of dread sinking deeper into her chest. The vehicle finally stopped, and the men didn't waste any time pulling her out again. This time she could see the shadow of an old run-down building in front of her, something that looked like an abandoned warehouse. The air smelled of oil and dust, and the only sound was the creaking of old metal. Her mind raced. She tried to think of any possible way out of this, any way she could escape, but there was nothing she could do. The men were stronger, more prepared than she was. She had no choice but to comply. They shoved her into the building and the door slammed shut behind her. Inside it was dark and cold. The place smelled musty. The walls lined with shadows that made it impossible to tell exactly where she was. The men didn't say much, just rough orders that she follow them. One of them tied her hands behind her back and another man placed a piece of cloth over her mouth to keep her quiet. She could hear them talking, but the words didn't make sense. They were angry, full of hate, and their voices echoed in the vast emptiness of the warehouse. She struggled to breathe through the cloth, but her mind kept returning to one thing. She needed to hold on. She needed to survive. She needed to hold on to the hope that somehow she would make it out of this. Her thoughts drifted to her family, to her children, and most of all to her husband. He was her rock, her protector. He had always been the one to keep her safe, to stand strong in the face of danger. He had always made her feel secure. She closed her eyes, trying to calm her breathing, knowing that the battle wasn't over. The woman didn't know it yet, but her husband was already on his way. And this nightmare would soon become a fight for survival, not just for her, but for the family they had built together. The woman's heart still pounded in her chest, her mind racing as she struggled to stay calm. She was bound and gagged, sitting in the cold, dark room of the warehouse, but she couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. The sound of the men's voices echoed in her mind, their words filled with hatred and anger. She had no idea why they had taken her, no idea what they wanted from her. But she knew one thing for certain. She had to find a way out. Her body ached from the rough handling, her muscles sore from the way they had dragged her through the streets. She could feel the tightness in her wrists where the rope had dug in, and the cloth over her mouth made it hard to breathe. Despite the fear and the pain, she refused to give in. She was strong, and she knew she had to be even stronger now. The men seemed to be arguing in the corner of the room, their voices rising and falling in angry bursts. She couldn't make out the words, but she could tell from their tone that they were frustrated. They had underestimated her, and she knew that they hadn't planned for someone like her, someone who wouldn't just give up. But she also knew that this situation was bigger than her. These men had no idea who they were messing with. Her husband was no ordinary man. He had spent years serving in the military, and not just any military. He was a highly trained Delta Force commander, a man who had faced down enemies in the most dangerous places on Earth. The idea that these men thought they could kidnap her without consequences was foolish. They had no idea what kind of storm they had just unleashed. Her thoughts turned to her husband. She could picture him now, his steady hands, his calm demeanor in the face of danger. He was resourceful, a master at problem solving. He wouldn't let her down. She believed that with everything in her. He would come for her. He would find a way to get to her no matter what it took. The seconds ticked by slowly, each one dragging on as she sat there, trying to think of any way she could help herself. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for something, anything that could help her escape. There was a small window near the ceiling, just barely big enough for her to fit through, but it was too high up to reach. Her hands were tied, and the cloth over her mouth made it difficult to focus. She heard footsteps approaching, and quickly, the door to the room opened. A man entered, his face hidden behind a mask, his eyes cold and unfeeling. He walked toward her, grabbing her roughly by the arm and pulling her to her feet. He didn't speak, just gestured for her to follow him. Her legs felt weak beneath her, but she stood tall, unwilling to show fear. They led her down a narrow hallway, and she realized that the building was much bigger than she had first thought. It was a labyrinth of rooms and hallways, the kind of place that criminals used to hide out and do their dirty work. She knew that getting out of here would be difficult, but she had to try. As they entered another room, her eyes adjusted to the dim light. It was empty except for a few old crates and piles of junk. The man pushed her into a chair and roughly tied her to it. Then he turned to leave without saying a word, the door slamming behind him. Her heart raced as she sat there, staring at the floor. She had to keep her wits about her. She couldn't let fear control her. Her husband would come for her, and until then, she had to survive. Back outside, her husband was already preparing for the worst. He had received the call just hours after the abduction, and every moment since then had been a blur of action. He had contacted the police, of course, but he knew they wouldn't be able to move quickly enough. He knew they'd be slow to respond, caught up in red tape and bureaucracy. He couldn't afford to wait. He'd spent the last several years in Delta Force training to deal with exactly these kinds of situations. When something like this happened, he didn't waste time with formalities. He was used to moving quickly, decisively. His mind was focused on one goal: to find his wife and bring her back home. He'd already reached out to his old contacts in the military, people who owed him favors, people who knew how to operate in the shadows. They had already started tracking the vehicle the kidnappers had used, piecing together the breadcrumbs left behind. Every lead they followed brought them closer to the truth. His mind kept returning to his wife, the image of her face still fresh in his mind. He remembered the way she had smiled at him just that morning, the warmth of her touch, the way she always seemed to know exactly what he needed. Now she was out there in the hands of these thugs. He could almost feel her fear, and it fueled his anger. He had no idea who these men were, but he would find them. And when he did, they would regret ever laying a hand on her. The hours stretched on as he prepared for the rescue mission. He gathered a small team, men he trusted with his life, men who had fought alongside him in some of the most dangerous corners of the world. Together they would storm the building, and together they would get her out. Back at the warehouse, the woman sat silently in the dark room, her mind racing. She was scared, yes, but she refused to show it. She would not let these men break her. They could bind her hands, gag her, and lock her away in a cold room, but they couldn't take away her will to survive. She knew that her husband was out there, somewhere, hunting for her. He wouldn't stop until he found her, and that thought gave her the strength to hold on. She just had to keep fighting, keep pushing through the fear. She couldn't give up. Not now. Every passing minute felt like an eternity, but she kept her head clear, waiting for the moment when the sound of boots on the floor would mean freedom. She could feel it coming. He was getting closer. The hours felt like days as the woman sat, still bound to the chair in that cold, dark room. She had tried everything she could think of to free herself, but the ropes around her wrists were tight and the cloth over her mouth made it nearly impossible to think clearly. Still, her mind was sharp, focused on survival and the hope that her husband would find her. Each time she heard footsteps outside the room, her heart skipped a beat. She wondered if it was one of the kidnappers coming to check on her, or if it was someone who could help her. But no matter how many times she tried to calm herself, the fear would creep in, and her heart would race again. But the more she thought about her situation, the more she realized how little control she had over it. Her captors were unpredictable, and she could feel the tension in the air. They had taken her for a reason, but what that reason was, she had no idea. She had no way of knowing how long they would keep her, or what their next move would be. The uncertainty was overwhelming. But one thing she knew for sure, she couldn't let fear take over. Her thoughts returned to her husband again. She didn't know exactly where he was, but she trusted him. He was a man of action, trained to handle any situation, no matter how dangerous. She knew he wouldn't rest until she was safe. She had faith in him. Meanwhile, her husband had been working tirelessly to find her. He was relentless in his pursuit, every step focused on one goal: to rescue his wife. He had been tracking the kidnappers for hours, and every lead brought him closer. The phone calls he made, the contacts he reached out to. Everything was falling into place. His military training kicked in as he pieced together the clues. He knew that time was of the essence, and every second counted. The kidnappers were holding his wife somewhere, and the longer he waited, the more dangerous it became. He couldn't afford to waste time. He had to move fast. With his team in tow, they had tracked down the vehicle used in the kidnapping. From there, they had found a trail that led them to a small, isolated area. It was a warehouse hidden away on the outskirts of town, the perfect place for criminals to hide. He knew exactly what this place was like. It was the kind of location he had trained to storm in his military days. His mind raced as he planned their next move. He couldn't let the kidnappers get away with this. They had taken his wife, and he would not rest until she was safe in his arms again. He had been through battles in far-off places, faced dangers that few could even imagine, but this was different. This wasn't just a mission, this was personal. His team moved quickly and quietly, avoiding any unnecessary noise. They had no room for mistakes. He had been in enough high-stakes situations to know that one wrong move could mean disaster. The element of surprise was their best chance. Back at the warehouse, the woman could hear the sounds of movement outside her room. Her heart leapt. Were they coming back to hurt her? Or were they getting ready to move her again? She strained her ears, trying to catch any hint of what was going on. The last thing she wanted was to be moved again. She couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment her husband would find her, if he was even close. As the hours passed, the uncertainty weighed heavily on her. The fear that she might never see her family again crept into her thoughts. But she forced herself to stay focused. She thought about the things that mattered: her children, her husband, the life they had built together. She thought about how much she loved them, and how she couldn't give up now. The building was eerily quiet at times, and at other moments she could hear the men arguing among themselves in another room. It seemed like they were becoming increasingly agitated. They didn't realize it yet, but their time was running out. The woman kept reminding herself that she had to hold on. The thought of her husband finding her kept her going. She knew he would come for her. He was a man of incredible strength and skill. No matter how difficult the situation seemed, he would find a way. Meanwhile, her husband and his team were closing in. They had finally located the warehouse and were now preparing to breach the building. He was calm as always, focused on the task at hand. But inside, his mind was full of thoughts of her. He was so close. He could feel it. He signaled to his team to move in. Every step they took was calculated and precise. They had trained for this moment and they were ready. The warehouse was surrounded, the area secure. There was no way the kidnappers would escape. Inside, the woman could hear something now. The faint sound of footsteps. She strained to hear, trying to make out what was happening. Was this the moment? Her hope began to rise. She had no way of knowing how close her husband was, but she could feel it in her bones. This was it. The door to her room opened suddenly and she froze. The man who entered was not one of the kidnappers. His uniform, his posture, it all spoke of military training. She barely had time to process what was happening before she heard a voice she would recognize anywhere. "Are you all right?" The voice was calm, steady, and filled with a strength that she knew immediately. Her heart skipped a beat. She looked up and there he was, her husband standing before her, his face filled with relief and determination. In that moment, everything changed. The nightmare was finally over. Her husband had found her. The moment her husband appeared in front of her, everything seemed to freeze. The world around her suddenly stopped, the chaos and fear of the past hours fading into a distant memory. For a moment, all she could do was look at him, her mind trying to comprehend what was happening. He was here. She was no longer alone. Her heart raced as she struggled to free herself from the ropes that had bound her for so long. She barely noticed the pain in her wrists as the rough rope finally gave way to his steady hands, working with practiced precision to untie her. He didn't need to say anything. The look in his eyes told her everything. The relief, the love, the determination. They all spoke louder than words ever could. As the ropes fell away, she could finally move, stretch her aching limbs, and take a deep breath. The cloth over her mouth was pulled off, and she gasped for air, taking in the clean, fresh scent of freedom. But the fear was still there, lingering just below the surface, and she couldn't help but feel vulnerable after everything she had been through. But her husband was here now, and that made all the difference. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder, offering reassurance without saying a word. She felt the warmth of his touch and knew that everything would be all right. He wasn't just a soldier trained for battle. He was her protector, her partner, and he had just brought her back from the edge of a nightmare. "Let's get you out of here," he said quietly, his voice steady, but filled with urgency. He helped her to her feet, supporting her as she swayed slightly, still weak from the ordeal. Her body felt like it had been through a war, but the fear was starting to lift as she realized they were leaving this place. Her husband motioned for his team to clear the area. The men moved swiftly, securing the room and making sure there were no other threats. The kidnappers were still unconscious, their weapons taken away and their plans shattered. They wouldn't be hurting anyone else. As they moved down the dark hallway, her husband stayed close to her, his presence a constant source of strength. She could hear the sound of his boots on the concrete floor, steady and unyielding, and it gave her the courage to keep moving. Every step felt like a victory, each moment taking her farther away from the danger she had been trapped in. They finally reached the exit, the heavy metal door groaning as it swung open. The night air hit her face like a wave, cool and refreshing. She took a deep breath, letting the clean air fill her lungs. The world outside was different now. It felt safer, more real, even though the memories of what had just happened would stay with her forever. The rescue operation hadn't been without its risks. Her husband's team had worked quickly, expertly, but they had no way of knowing what might be waiting for them inside. The building was filled with shadows, with danger lurking around every corner. But they had been prepared. Her husband had been prepared. As they stepped outside, she looked up at the sky. It was dark now, the stars barely visible through the city's lights. But she didn't care. She was safe. She was with her husband. The kidnappers would be caught and justice would be served. She knew this, just as she knew that her life, their life, would eventually return to normal. The sound of sirens grew louder as police vehicles pulled into the area, their lights flashing in the distance. The operation was over. Her husband had done what he had promised. He had brought her home. But even as the police began to take control, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The memories of the past few days would linger, and the process of healing would take time. There would be nights when she would wake up in a cold sweat, remembering the fear she had felt when she was taken. But she also knew that she had made it through. With her husband by her side, they would find a way to heal together. Her husband turned to her, his expression softening just a little as he spoke again, his voice more tender this time. "I'm so glad you're okay," he said. His words were simple, but they held so much meaning. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of the days that had passed since the moment he had heard the news. He had been through hell trying to get to her, but he had never once faltered. "I knew you'd come for me," she whispered, her voice shaky but filled with conviction. She had known all along. He was her rock, and she could count on him no matter what. He smiled gently, a rare moment of softness on his usually hard face. "Always," he replied. The team moved to secure the area further, ensuring no one else could interfere. The woman and her husband stood side by side, watching as the scene unfolded. Her mind was still processing everything, but it was starting to feel real. She was free. She was going home. As the police handled the aftermath, her husband turned to her and gently placed his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, grateful for his presence. The night, which had started with terror, now felt like the first step toward healing. They would face the aftermath together, and though it would be hard, they would get through it. She would rebuild. They both would. And this was the moment when they would start again, a new chapter together.